What's up gamers, DreamcastGuy here, talking today about the Game Boy. Now, to some of you, this may be just a piece of ancient history and something that doesn't really matter, but to me, this is such an important part of my life. You see, growing up, I moved a lot. I think I went to 10 different schools growing up, and it was very, very difficult to try and make friends, obviously, but thankfully, I always had one of these in my pocket, and it actually made it where I had a way to make friends rather quick. Every time I'd move to a new school, I'd find the gamer kids and start trading Pokemon or beating them up in Mortal Kombat. So because of it, I became a lifelong lover of the Game Boy, which is why when we started getting things like the NES Classic Edition or the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, I was always secretly hoping that at some point we'd get a Game Boy Classic Edition, something that would package together so many great games from this freaking great device and make them all accessible in one spot. Well, Nintendo hasn't done it yet, but somebody else decided to step up and do it for them. Now, this is called the Bittboy, and I've spent the last couple days playing a ton of it, and it is a very interesting thing to mess with. But I want to say that I think it's a little bit questionably legal. It is a ROM device. This actually plays different sort of emulated games and runs them rather well. But really, I guess what really comes down to it is it any good? Let's find out. Over the course of the last few years, we've started to see the rise of the clone console. These are unofficial systems that happen to be able to play official games. It'll basically be something like a little gadget that lets you boot up Nintendo 64 stuff, or maybe something that lets you play the entire catalog of the Sega Genesis. Well, this one is very unique in that it actually works for 3 separate systems all in one. The Bittboy is something that is able to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and the original Nintendo. Now that in itself is very, very cool, but what's most important is obviously how the games run. Because by far the most annoying aspect of a lot of clone consoles is that many of them run like trash. But I can thankfully say that when it comes to the Bittboy, these games work very good. At least 99% do. So let's take a look at some random stuff here. I'm going to be filming the screen for this video, that way you see an accurate representation of how it'll look when you just pick up and start playing it. Let's begin by just checking out some random NES. Now obviously I am a huge lover of stuff like Castlevania, so here's just some nice Castlevania clips. Now the first thing that really jumps out is that the screen is very, very bright and very, very clear, and there doesn't seem to be even a shred of lag. So everything is running exactly the way it would if you were somehow playing a tiny condensed version of the original Nintendo. There are some different visual options if you want. So some of the built-in features are the ability to do things like play it widescreen or do something like create save states. This does bring me to something, though, that I consider a very strange drawback, and something that probably baffles me the most when it comes to the Bittboy, which is that a lot of times in this video, you're going to see me messing with different functions of it, but you'll notice that there is almost no external buttons for it. If I want to do something like adjust the volume, I actually have to hold select and tap B and A. Or if I want to try and increase or decrease the screen brightness, I need to hold select and press Turbo A or Turbo B. On the surface, this seems like they're just trying to cut corners and make it where they're not having to have as many external little doodads and little extra knobs on it, but I think that the actual reason for this is that everything inside this is very obviously running on some very straightforward, very basic emulators. They're good enough to work, it just seems like everything is trying to be as basic as it humanly can be. Now, just for a second, I want to actually flip over to the Game Boy Color, because this is the only other system that's really has some problems here and there. Now, this is very minor. It's definitely not a bunch of them, but I purposely got a bunch of the games that push the hardware limits the most of the Game Boy Color. Many people who didn't grow up with this thing probably think that the graphics are quite basic, but the internal processor of the Game Boy Color was actually quite strong, and it was able to put out some pretty hefty visuals when it really wanted to, but there was a couple that were really redlining it, being the strongest games that were ever on this console console, and one of them is Shantae. This is the, of course, little game where you're playing as a genie and having fun adventures, and as you can see, it has quite a few weird glitches all over the screen when it's trying to run. I really can't figure out what's causing this. I tried to mess with different functionality, and everything just kinda looks a bit scrambled. Now, other games also have these problems, but in different ways. Like if you're trying to play something like Pokemon Crystal, this is a Game Boy Color game that obviously is based around the idea of having an internal clock. It would detect the time via the internal storage of the Game Boy Color. That meant that certain Pokemon would show up during the day or certain Pokemon show up during the night. Well, that doesn't work on this because it's just an emulator. Now, other than these problems though, I actually think that these things run very smooth. And one of my big concerns was making sure that the color palette was correct. So here's just a side-by-side comparison. One screen is the 3DS XL running a copy of Link's Awakening, which is one of my very favorite Zelda games, and the other one is the Bittboy. And I just want to show a lot of this here to really kind of display the fact that it actually has the full range of color in it. The camera is trying to autofocus a little bit here because there's two separate screens doing different stuff, but you can really tell that the entire palette is there. It's not washed out. This isn't a crappy, cheap screen. It's actually very, very functional, whether you're playing it in widescreen or just in full normal color. I do want to say though that it's very, very good for the Game Boy games the best. Game Boy Color games are pretty good, but with some stuff on the original Nintendo, I did notice that there was a little bit of a problem when I was trying to play certain RPGs. Now, one of my favorite games of all time is Final Fantasy. I'm totally obsessed with these games and have beaten every version of them. But on this, the text is obviously far too tiny. I mean, most of us are going to be holding a handheld a couple of feet from our face, but in this case, that's not really something you can do. You need to keep it very close to your eyes to squint and hopefully see all the little tiny details on the screen. There is a way around this though, or a solution to this problem, and definitely the most bizarre part of this system is that it actually has a video out option. Within the box of the Bittboy comes an actual AV cable that plugs into the device and directly into an old school TV. So if you want, you can play games in full scale on an actual television. And that's kind of appalling because, I mean, I feel like that's a great use of the emulation. This is a very interesting workaround and certainly something that you could keep in mind if you're trying to just find a way to be a weird collector like I am, or maybe just find a new way to play Game Boy games on the big screen. I especially like this as somebody who is a huge original Game Boy collector. Now, just looking at some random gameplay of, well, one of my favorite games on the Game Boy is actually Super Mario Bros. 2 and the 6 Golden Coins. Now, this game looks fantastic. It's super crisp, the audio is the right speed, everything is really, really clean, and it's great. I like the fact that I could play this on a television if I wanted, in its original black and white, or on this screen. But it does bring me to a giant drawback, which is that, for some reason, the battery life is very, very limited. So even if you're trying to play this on minimum brightness with the volume off, it only lasts about 4 hours. So I tested this a lot while I was trying to basically travel around and do my Christmas shopping, and even while I'm here bored sitting in a store just watching somebody pick out shoes, yes, that's really what was happening, it's nice that I can just pull this out of a pocket and play it for a couple minutes. But if you're trying to really be a serious gamer and sit down with this, it's not going to be able to really fulfill that niche. This is something that, in my opinion, is mostly a novelty item. It's for people like me who already own every single thing you can imagine Game Boy related. I've got Game Boy wallets, Game Boy backpacks, every Game Boy game, so now the last real frontier is weird stuff like this. I think a big benefit is the fact that this is so dirt cheap. Right now it's on sale for $40, but even full price it's only $60. So if you're somebody who's really into playing old school stuff, it's something that I think is very, very cool and certainly worth adding to the collection. For those who are looking at this as an extra way to try and beat some rare RPGs on the go like Final Fantasy Adventure on the Game Boy or something very peculiar like Dragon Quest, I just want to say you should probably be gentle. I've only had this for a couple days and I've been using it a lot and I really enjoy it, and I haven't had any sort of like wiggling D-pads or anything that makes me think it could break down. It's just one of those things that it does feel like, due to its incredibly lightweight build, that eventually it is going to disintegrate. For $40 though, personally, I guess if I only got a year out of this, I'd still have a blast. And the fact that at any time I can just pop out my memory card and put way more ROMs on it using any micro SD makes it where I'm going to be constantly trying to cycle in new games, play new stuff, maybe try out some hacked ROMs. This is a great way to play different stuff, especially because at the end of the day, it's just a new cool thing to play, to put in your pocket, take on the go, and enjoy weirdness anywhere. I've always kind of considered this time period that we're in right now the age of technology, because stuff that was just super cutting edge a couple of years ago is now just humongous. This is a couple pounds, whereas this is a few ounces. And this is, surprisingly, the more powerful gadget. Am I glad I have it in my pocket? Heck yes! Is it the best thing ever? Not quite. But it's certainly worth the money. Thanks so much for watching, gamers. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, tell me your favorite Game Boy games in the comments down below, and share this video if you want. But do me the biggest favor of all and keep dreaming. I am seriously going to keep playing this thing a bunch. It's just so cool. I love having really tiny little gadgets, and this is one that's so teeny tiny and so authentic to the original charm that I can't help but get a big kick out of it. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.